The rope bit into Murak Doomhammer's wrists as the crowd on the Saltmere pier howled for her blood, and the headsman's axe rose glinting in the gray morning light. And for one terrible heartbeat, Clayton Ramsey watched the blade reach the top of its arc, and knew that if he did not move right now, in the next breath, a woman he had never spoken to would die on a fishing dock with gulls screaming overhead. He did not remember deciding to run. He remembered only the axe he carried slung over his shoulder every day of his working life, the same one he used to split cordwood at the edge of the graywood, coming off his back and into his hands, and his boots pounding the salt-slicked planks, and the headsman's downswing arriving a half-breath too late, because Clayton Ramsey had already thrown himself between the falling blade and the kneeling orc woman, catching the haft of the headsman's axe on his own and driving it wide with a shriek of iron that echoed off the cliffs. The crowd went silent all at once, the way a wave goes silent right before it breaks. "Are you mad?" The headsman bellowed, staggering back, his hood askew, sweat cutting lines through the salt grime on his face. "Step aside, woodcutter, this is not your quarrel." "She's kneeling on a public dock with her hands bound," Clayton said, and his voice came out steadier than he felt, steadier than his knees, which were shaking beneath his patched trousers. "There's been no trial. Magistrate Vale said there'd be a trial." "There was a trial," snapped Magistrate Corwin Vale, stepping down from the little raised platform where he'd stood to watch the execution he had ordered, his fine wool coat entirely wrong for the wind coming off the water, his rings catching the light. "It was this morning, before you woke, woodcutter. An orc raider caught skulking near the town hall in the dead of night, found with a stolen blade, sentenced by the harbor court. Step away from the block." Murak Doomhammer had not moved. She knelt with her wrists bound behind her dark braided hair falling across a face set like carved stone, and her amber eyes had not once left the axe blade that had nearly taken her head. Now those eyes moved, slow and deliberate, to the man who had stopped it, and something in them was not gratitude. It was suspicion, sharp and immediate, the look of a warrior deciding whether a stranger's mercy was a trap. "I do not need a human's pity," she said, and her voice was low and rough, carrying easily over the murmuring crowd. "Step back, woodcutter, and let them finish it. I would rather die honest than owe my life to a man who does not know what he is buying." "I'm not buying anything," Clayton said. "I'm just not watching a woman get her head taken off without a trial anyone in this town actually saw." A ripple went through the crowd at that. Dock hands and fishwives and net menders who had gathered thinking they'd see a hanging, and instead were seeing the town's quiet charcoal burner, a man most of them barely spoke to from one season to the next, standing between the magistrate's headsman and a bound orc warrior with his own felling axe raised like he meant to use it. "There was a trial," Vale said again, softer now, dangerous now. "Are you calling the harbor court a liar, Ramsey?" Clayton looked at the magistrate's fine coat and his soft hands and the way his eyes kept flicking, just for a fraction of a second, toward the town hall up the hill, toward the shuttered building where, Clayton would later learn, a hammer wrapped in oilcloth sat locked in a cedar chest that Corwin Vale checked on every single night. He didn't know any of that yet. He only knew that something about the man's haste to see this woman dead before midday, before any of the fishing boats came in and their crews could ask questions, sat wrong in his gut, the way spoiled meat sits wrong before you can even name the smell. "I'm saying I want to see it in the town record," Clayton said. "I'm saying if she's guilty, she'll still be guilty tomorrow, and if she's not, you'll have killed her for nothing, and I don't think this town wants that on its hands, not with the Doomhammer clan camped 2 days' ride inland and plenty capable of asking why one of their own went missing near our harbor." That did what Clayton's courage alone could not have done. A murmur of unease moved through the crowd, because every soul on that pier had grown up on stories of orc warbands and burned granaries, and not one of them wanted to be the village that started a fresh war over a hasty hanging. Vale's jaw worked. He looked at the crowd, gauging them, the way a man reads weather before deciding whether to sail. "Fine," he said at last, spitting the word like a fish bone. "Fine, no hanging today. But she is a danger and a trespasser, and this harbor will not simply release her to wander. Someone must stand bond for her, answer for her, keep her from our doors and our children until we decide what's to be done." His eyes found Clayton's, and there was something cruel and pleased in them, as if he'd found a way to turn this failure into a private joke. "Since you're so certain of her innocence, woodcutter, you may have the honor. She's yours to guard. If she so much as bruises a soul in this town, it's your neck that answers for it, not the harbor courts." The crowd laughed, ugly and relieved all at once, and somewhere a woman called out that the charcoal burner had gone and adopted himself an orc, and somewhere else a man spat onto the planks, and Clayton felt his face burn hot despite the cold wind. But he looked down at Murak Doomhammer, at the woman kneeling in the salt spray with rope biting her wrists and blood from a cut lip drying dark on her chin, and he thought that, whatever this cost him, it was better than watching that axe finish its work. "All right," he said. "I'll stand bond for her." Murak's eyes snapped up to his, and for the first time the suspicion in them cracked open into something like fury. "You will not speak for me as though I am cargo," she said. "No," Clayton agreed, kneeling to cut the rope at her wrists with his belt knife, careful of the blade near her skin, careful of her, though every instinct in the watching crowd screamed that he ought to be careful of her in an entirely different way. "But I'd rather speak for you than watch you die for a trial nobody saw. You can hate me for it on the walk home." She did hate him for it, or said she did. The entire 2 miles from the harbor to the edge of the Greywood, where his cabin and charcoal pits sat among the first ranks of pine and birch. She walked ahead of him with her wrists finally free, and her chin lifted like a queen being marched to her own coronation rather than a captive under bond. And every few dozen steps she turned to inform him, in that low, rough voice, exactly what she thought of humans who played hero for crowds, of woodcutters who smelled of smoke and pine sap, of a harbor town that would murder a woman on a dock and call it justice. "You could simply say thank you," Clayton offered once, when they'd cleared the last stone cottages and the gulls had given way to the deeper hush of the tree line. "I could," Murak said. "I will not. Thanking you would mean admitting I needed saving, and I did not need saving, woodcutter. I needed one more breath to break that rope myself. You were kneeling with a headsman's axe over your neck. I was choosing my moment." Clayton almost laughed, and something about the almost laugh, some crack of warmth in a man who by all rights should have looked terrified walking a bound-free orc warrior into the deep woods alone, made Murak glance sideways at him, just once, just long enough to take him in properly for the first time. He was not a large man, not next to her. She stood a full head taller than him and broader through the shoulder besides, all corded muscle beneath gray-green skin, her dark hair pulled back in thick braids threaded with small bone beads, her jaw strong and marked by 2 neat lower tusks that caught the light when she spoke. She wore fitted travel leathers, dark and well-worn, laced tight up a torso built for war and cinched with steel-studded straps at the waist that did nothing to hide and everything to flatter a figure more dangerous than any blade she might have carried. And she carried none now, her axes taken by the harbor guard, leaving her with only her hands and her fury. Clayton beside her was neither small nor soft. Years of splitting cordwood and hauling charcoal sacks had put a working strength into his shoulders and forearms, but standing near her he felt every inch the ordinary man he was. Sandy-haired, plain-featured, sun-browned from a life spent at the edge of the trees, the kind of man villages tend to overlook when they're counting their notable sons. He caught her looking and did not flinch from it. "You can look all you like," he said. "I'm not much to see. Just a man who burns wood into charcoal and sells it to the smith and the salt house." "I was deciding," Murak said, "whether you are brave or simply a fool. Might be both." "Most fools are," she said, and for the first time, something that was almost a smile touched the corner of her mouth before she smothered it. The camp at the forest's edge was modest, a low timber cabin with a stone hearth, a lean-to for tools, 3 earthen charcoal pits banked and smoking gently under their turf covers, cords of drying wood stacked man-high along the tree line. It was not much, Clayton knew, not compared to a stone keep or even a proper farmhouse, but it was his, built with his own hands over 6 lonely years since his father had died and left him the trade and the little clearing and nothing else. No brothers, no wife, no one to share the long winter nights with but the crackle of the hearth and the wind in the pines. Murak surveyed it all with an expression that gave away nothing. "This is where you mean to keep me." "This is where I live," Clayton said. "I've a spare pallet and blankets enough. You're not a prisoner, whatever Vale said in front of the crowd. You're just under my bond. Which mostly means I have to make sure you don't murder anyone, and you have to not murder anyone, and otherwise I don't see why we can't just get on with things." "Get on with things," Murak repeated flatly. "You saved my life in front of an entire harbor town, chained yourself to my fate with a magistrate's threat hanging over your own neck, and you speak of it as though it were nothing more than a delayed delivery of firewood. Would you rather I made a speech about it?" "I would rather," she said, stepping close enough that he had to tip his head back to hold her gaze, close enough that he could smell salt and blood and something underneath it that was warm and living and entirely her own, "that you understood what you have done. Among my clan, a life owed is not a small thing. It is a debt that does not simply vanish because a magistrate finds it convenient." "I didn't do it to collect a debt," Clayton said, and meant it, and something in the plain honesty of it seemed to unsettle her more than any clever answer could have. She turned away first, which he would come to learn later was rare for her, and looked instead at the smoking charcoal pits and the stacked wood and the small, poor, honest shape of a life built alone at the edge of a forest. "Then you are a greater fool than I thought," she said quietly, "because a debt like that uncollected has a way of collecting itself." He did not know, not yet, how right she would prove to be. The first days passed in a strange, wary truce. Murak slept or lay awake, Clayton suspected, listening to every creak of the cabin and every call of a night bird on the spare pallet nearest the door, positioned, he noticed, so she could reach it before he could reach his own weapons. She ate little the first day, watching him prepare a thin stew of salt fish and barley as though she expected poison, and only when he'd eaten a full bowl himself first, without comment, without making a show of it, did she finally take up her own spoon. "You did not have to prove it was safe," she said. "Didn't want you thinking I was the sort of man who'd poison a guest," Clayton said, "even a guest under bond. I am not a guest. You're eating my stew in my cabin. Close enough." By the 3rd day she had begun, grudgingly, to help, not because he asked, but because, she informed him with considerable scorn, watching a human fumble an axe into a stubborn knot of oak was an insult to every tree that had ever grown. She took the axe from his hands with a casualness that made the 6-foot log look like kindling and split it in 2 clean strokes and looked at him with open challenge in her amber eyes as if daring him to be offended. "Show off," Clayton said, grinning despite himself. "You have no idea," Murak said, "how easily I could split you the same way." "I believe you. You should. It is a rare human who does." There was something in the way she said it, testing him, always testing him, that told Clayton this was how she had survived, among her own clan and among the humans who feared and hated her kind in equal measure. By staying sharp-edged, by never letting anyone close enough to see beneath the warrior's armor to whatever lay under it. He found himself, against every sensible instinct a lonely woodcutter should have had about harboring an orc warrior under a magistrate's bond, wanting very badly to see beneath it anyway. It happened first on the 5th night, over nothing at all, an argument about whether the fire needed more wood or less, absurd and small, the kind of argument 2 people have when they are dancing around something larger and do not yet have words for it. Murak had stood too close, jabbing a finger into his chest to make some point about human wastefulness with good timber, and Clayton had caught her wrist without thinking, not to stop her, just to hold it, and the argument had died in both their throats at once. "Let go," Murak said, though she did not pull away. I will, Clayton said, if you actually want me to. For a long moment neither of them moved, the fire popping and hissing between them, her wrist warm and strong in his rough hand, her amber eyes searching his face for the trick she was certain must be there. When she found none, when she found only a plain, tired, honest man looking back at her without fear, and without the leering caution most humans wore around her kind, something in her seemed to give way, just slightly, just enough. She kissed him first. He would remember that always, that for all his courage on the dock, it was Murak Doomhammer who closed the last inch between them, gripping the front of his shirt in one fist and pulling him up onto his toes to meet her mouth with a hunger that startled them both. It lasted only a handful of heartbeats before she wrenched back, breathing hard, looking furious at herself in a way that had nothing to do with him. That should not have happened, she said. Didn't feel like a mistake, Clayton said, his own breath none too steady. That is precisely the problem, Murak said, and retreated to her pallet and said nothing more that night, though Clayton lay awake long after the fire burned to embers, replaying the taste of salt and warmth on his mouth, and wondering how a man so ordinary had come to want, more than he had ever wanted anything, a woman entirely capable of splitting him in two. She told him about the hammer 9 days after the gallows. They were sitting by the pit fire, mending a torn charcoal sack between them, when she set the needle down and looked at him with an expression he had not seen from her before, not fury, not scorn, but something closer to grief. You saved my life, she said, and you have fed me and sheltered me and taken a magistrate's threat onto your own head, and I have told you nothing true about why I was on that dock. I think that is unfair to you. I figured you'd tell me when you were ready, Clayton said. I am not ready, but you have earned it regardless. She drew a slow breath. 3 generations ago, my clan's chieftain, my grandmother's grandmother, carried into battle a hammer forged from meteor iron, blessed by our shamans, called Doomhammer, from which my whole line takes its name. It is not merely a weapon. It is the heart of our clan's honor, carried at every moot, raised at every naming, buried with every chieftain who dies with it in hand, except that our chieftain did not die with it in hand. She died on a beach not far from your harbor, cut down by human raiders in a war neither side remembers starting, and the hammer was taken as a trophy and has sat ever since, wrapped in oilcloth, locked in a cedar chest in your town hall, paraded out once a year so your magistrate can tell the harbor it protects them from storms. Clayton set the sack aside slowly. Vale has it. Vale's grandfather took it. Vale keeps it. And in 11 days, at the full moon, my clan gathers for the return of ancestors, when every chieftain's weapon must be present at the fire or the clan's honor is broken and cannot be mended for a generation. My father sent 3 warriors before me to retrieve it. None returned. I came alone because I believed I could be quiet where they had been bold, and instead I was caught before I ever touched the chest, and I would be dead on that dock right now if not for a woodcutter with more courage than sense. 11 days, Clayton said. 11 days, or my clan loses something it cannot get back, and my father, who is chieftain now, and who has already lost 3 warriors to this, may decide that a harbor town which murders orcs on its docks and hoards stolen ancestors in cedar chests deserves whatever comes next. Her eyes were steady on his. I do not say that as a threat to you. I say it because you deserve to know exactly what debt you have chained yourself to, woodcutter, before you decide whether to help me finish what I came to do. Clayton was quiet for a long moment, watching the fire, thinking of Vale's soft hands and his fine coat and the way his eyes had flicked toward the town hall on the dock, thinking of the crowd's ugly relieved laughter, thinking of 11 days. I'll help you, he said. You do not know what you are agreeing to. I know that if I don't, you'll go alone again, and next time there won't be anyone at the gallows to cut the rope in time. He met her eyes. I know that a whole harbor's worth of people I've traded with my whole life were ready to watch you die for a trial they never saw, over a hammer their magistrate stole 2 generations back and lied about ever since. That doesn't sit right in me, Murak. I'm helping you because it's right, not because of any debt. Something in her face, hearing her own name in his mouth for the first time. She had never given it to him outright, he realized. He'd learned it only from the harbor crowds shouting, softened in a way that had nothing to do with warriors' caution at all. Then we go together, she said. And if we are caught, we die together, and I would rather that than watch you throw your life away on my behalf a second time without at least standing beside you for it. They spent the remaining days before the theft learning the shape of the town hall from the outside. Clayton, known and unremarkable, could walk the square at dusk, selling the last of a charcoal delivery, without drawing a second glance, counting guards, marking the watchman's rounds, noting which shutter on the north side had a broken latch that the caretaker never fixed because it opened onto nothing but a drop to the rocks below. Murak stayed hidden in the deep woods by day, and by night the two of them pored over what he'd learned, her quick mind turning his plain observations into a plan with a warrior's precision. "The chest is locked," Clayton said on the 9th night, sketching the hall's floor plan in ash on a flat stone. "Vale wears the key on a chain always. I've seen it at market. We'd need to take it from him directly or force the lock." "I can force a lock," Murak said. "What I cannot do is force it quietly, and quiet is what 11 days and a broken watchman's schedule by us. We go on the night after next, when the tide is highest and the surf covers footsteps on the rocks below that north window. And if we're seen—" Murak looked at him, and there was something fierce and tender both in the look, an expression he was coming to recognize as entirely, dangerously hers. "Then I make certain you are not the one who pays for it," she said. "Whatever comes, woodcutter, you do not stand between me and a blade again without my leave. I did not ask to be saved once so that I could watch it happen twice." "Can't promise that," Clayton said honestly. "Not where you're concerned." "Then we are both fools," Murak said, "and perhaps that is why this has not yet gone entirely wrong." The night of the theft came in on a hard sea wind, the tide crashing white against the rocks below the town hall exactly as Murak had predicted, loud enough to swallow the scrape of her boots finding purchase on the wet stone, and the soft click of the broken shutter latch giving way under Clayton's knife blade. They came through the north window into a storeroom smelling of old parchment and lamp oil, Murak moving with a hunter's silence that made Clayton, for all his woodsman's care, feel clumsy as a felled log beside her. The cedar chest sat exactly where Clayton had guessed, in the small side chamber Vale used as his private office, locked with an iron clasp that took Murak 3 tenths, sweating minutes to work loose with a bent nail, and a will that would not be denied. When the lid finally creaked open, the oilcloth-wrapped shape within seemed almost to glow in the lamplight leaking under the door from the hall beyond, and Murak's hands, when she lifted it free, trembled not from fear, Clayton understood, but from something far older and far deeper, a reverence that had waited 3 generations to be answered. "We have it," she breathed. "Ramsey, we—" The door swung open. The watchman stood framed in it, lantern raised, mouth already opening to shout, and Clayton moved before thought caught up to instinct, closing the distance in 2 strides and driving the man back into the corridor with a shoulder to the chest. Not a blow, never a blow, just weight and momentum enough to send the lantern spinning from his grip to shatter on the flagstones, oil catching in a bright, ugly flare that lit the hall like a struck match. The watchman's shout finally came, ragged and loud, echoing out into the square, and beyond the windows Clayton heard other voices answering it, boots on cobbles, the harbor town waking to trouble in the dark. "Go," Murak said, the hammer clutched to her chest, already moving for the broken window. "Ramsey, go now. I'm not leaving you to fight your way out alone. I'm not asking you to fight," she snapped, hauling him bodily through the narrow window frame by the collar of his shirt with a strength that left his feet briefly dangling over the rocks and the churning tide below. "I am telling you to run. because I would rather explain myself to my clan for failing than explain to myself why I let you die for a hammer that is not even yours to bleed for." They ran, both of them, down the wet black rocks with the tide clawing at their boots and torches already flaring to life on the cliff path above, shouts multiplying, the whole harbor rousing behind them like a hive struck with a stick, until the rocks gave way to the tree line, and the tree line swallowed them into merciful dark. And they did not stop running until the sea's roar had faded to a distant murmur, and Clayton's lungs burned and Murak, ahead of him, finally slowed to a walk beside a narrow stream cutting down through mossy stone toward a shallow cave mouth. She seemed to know without having ever been told. It was there in the cave's mouth, with the stolen hammer laid reverently across a flat stone, and the adrenaline of the chase only just beginning to drain from both their bodies, that Clayton first noticed the blood. "You're hurt," he said, catching her arm as she swayed slightly, the hammer's weight no longer holding her upright. "It is nothing," Murak said, but when he pulled back the torn leather at her side, the gash beneath it caught, he guessed, on the shattered lantern glass or a jagged edge of window frame in the scramble, was neither shallow nor nothing, a long dark line seeping steadily against her gray-green skin. "Sit down," Clayton said, already tearing a strip from his own shirt. "Let me look at it properly. You are not a healer." "No, but I've stitched up my own share of axe cuts living alone in these woods for 6 years, and you're not bleeding on my watch without at least trying to stop it." He pressed the makeshift bandage to the wound, firm and careful, and felt her flinch, and felt more than that, the way she let him, the way this warrior who had faced a headsman's axe without a tremor went utterly still and pliant under his hands now, watching his face instead of his work with an intensity that made his own hands less than steady. "You are gentle," she said quietly, "for a man who threw himself between me and a blade without blinking. Figured you'd had enough of people being rough with you today." Her breath caught oddly at that small and sharp, and when he glanced up she was looking at him with an expression he had not seen from her before, something raw and unguarded and almost frightened, though nothing in this world seemed to frighten Murak Doomhammer. "There is a custom among my people," she said slowly, as if the words cost her something to shape, "that you should know now before this goes further than it already has. When a warrior of my clan chooses another as truly hers, not a lover taken lightly, not a passing want, but chosen, claimed, bound, she marks them. Here." Her fingers rose to touch the curve of his shoulder, just above the collarbone, light as a held breath. "A bite, not a wound meant to maim. A mark meant to be seen and known and worn without shame, so that any who look upon it understand this person belongs to a warrior fierce enough to have chosen them above all others. It is not given lightly. Most orcs never give it at all. It is," she seemed to search for the human word, "my signature. The one thing entirely mine to give, and once given, it cannot be taken back." Clayton did not move, did not breathe, very aware of her fingers still resting warm against his shoulder, of the firelight from the small cook fire he'd started catching the gold in her eyes. "And if a human wore it," he said, "what then? Then he would be marked as mine before both our peoples, and there is no law of my clan or your harbor that could easily unmake it." She swallowed. "I should not have told you that. I do not know why I told you that, except that you sat here bandaging a wound I could have tended myself, and you looked at me as though my blood mattered to you, and I have not been looked at that way by anyone in longer than I can remember." "I wouldn't mind wearing it," Clayton said very quietly, and meant every word of it, though his heart was hammering hard enough that he was certain she could hear it in the small cave silence. "If it's yours to give, I wouldn't mind at all." Murak went very still. Her hand slid from his shoulder to the side of his jaw, tilting his face up toward hers, and he could see the decision moving behind her eyes. The warrior weighing a claim she had never once in her life imagined offering to a man of the people who had killed her chieftain, and locked her clan's honor in a cedar chest for 3 generations. She leaned down, slow, deliberate, her mouth finding the curve of his throat where shoulder met neck, her breath hot against his skin, her lips parting, the faint scrape of a tusk grazing skin that had gone electric with waiting. A twig snapped, sharp and unmistakable, somewhere in the dark beyond the cave mouth. Murak went rigid, breaking away so fast Clayton nearly toppled sideways, her hand already closing around the haft of the stolen hammer, her whole body coiled toward the sound. It was only a deer in the end, some startled shape crashing off through the underbrush and gone. But the moment, whatever it had been building toward, whatever mark had been a breath from being set into his skin forever, had shattered with the twig, and Murak did not try to reclaim it. She sat back on her heels, breathing hard, staring at the dark tree line as though it had personally betrayed her. "We should move before dawn," she said, her voice rough in a way that had nothing to do with the run through the rocks. "They will search the coast road first. If we go inland through the deep wood, we can reach ground my clan's scouts range within 2 days. Murak." "Do not," she said, not unkindly but with a warning in it. "Do not make me say why I stopped. Not tonight, please." He did not push her. He only nodded and banked the small fire and let her walk ahead of him into the dark with the hammer of her ancestors cradled against her chest like something newly born, and told himself that whatever had almost happened in that cave was not gone, only waiting, the way the tide always comes back even after it pulls away from the shore. They did not reach the deep wood. Vale's men found their trail at first light, not through skill but through simple bad luck. A fisherman gathering driftwood along the coast road had seen 2 shapes moving through the tree line at dawn, and being a man who valued the reward Vale had already posted for the hammer's return, had run straight to the harbor with the news. By the time Clayton and Murak broke from the trees into a narrow ravine meant to cut a full half-day off their inland route, a dozen armed men were already spreading out along the ridge above them, and at their head, mounted and furious, rode Corwin Vale himself, his fine coat traded for a boiled leather cuirass, a crossbow across his saddle. "There," he shouted, "there, take the woodcutter alive. I want him to answer for treason before the whole town and kill the orc if she resists." "Run," Murak said, shoving the hammer into Clayton's arms with a force that nearly staggered him. "Take it, go. I will hold the ravine mouth. I'm not leaving you to fight a dozen men alone." "You will do exactly that," Murak said, already turning to meet the first of Vale's men scrambling down the scree, bare-handed against drawn steel. "Because if they take the hammer again, everything we have done means nothing, and if they take you, I will burn this entire harbor to the waterline, and I would rather not become that particular kind of monster before breakfast." There was no time to argue. Clayton ran, the hammer's weight strange and sacred in his arms, and behind him he heard the clash of steel and Murak's furious voice, and worse, the twang of a crossbow string, and every instinct screamed at him to turn back. But he had promised her in his own way, on that first walk from the harbor, that he would not throw his life away carelessly a second time, and so he ran, hating himself for it. Until the ravine spat him out onto a bare hillside, where a second knot of Vale's men had been waiting all along, and rough hands seized him before he'd taken 3 more steps. They dragged Clayton back to Saltmere in chains fashioned from fishing net wire, the hammer taken from him almost gently by Vale himself, who cradled it the way a man cradles gold rather than the way Murak had cradled it, like a beloved grandmother's bones. Murak they brought in an hour later, bruised and bloodied but alive, 3 of Vale's men needing to be carried in behind her, and the harbor square that had gathered once already for a hanging gathered again now, buzzing with a very different energy, not the detached curiosity of watching a stranger die, but the ugly, frightened fury of a town that believed its own woodcutter had betrayed it for an orc raider. "Clayton Ramsey," Vale announced from the same raised platform, the recovered hammer laid across his knees like a trophy already, "stood bond for this creature and repaid the harbor's mercy with theft and treason. The law is clear. A man who conspires with a raider against his own town forfeits the town's protection entirely. He looked out over the crowd, and Clayton, wrists bound, saw the moment Vale decided to make a spectacle of this, saw the calculation behind the magistrate's eyes, the understanding that a second, harsher execution would silence any whispers about a trial no one had witnessed and make Vale himself look strong instead of merely cruel. He will hang within the hour on this same dock, and the orc will watch, so that she carries word back to her clan of exactly what befalls those who steal from this harbor. The crowd roared its approval, or close enough to it, and Clayton, standing on the same planks where he had once cut a rope free with his own axe, felt the strange, distant calm of a man who has run out of options and simply has to endure whatever comes next. They walked him to the same gallows post. They fitted the same rough noose around his neck. Somewhere behind him he could hear Murak straining against the men holding her, her voice raw and furious, and beneath the fury, something that broke his heart worse than the rope at his throat. "Vale, you coward, you liar, that hammer is not yours to keep. It was never yours. Silence her," Vale said mildly, not even looking up from adjusting the noose's angle himself, savoring it. "Let her watch." The headsman raised his axe, not for a swing at Clayton's neck this time, but to cut the platform's release lever, the mechanism that would drop the trapdoor beneath Clayton's feet and let the rope do its work. And Clayton, staring out at the crowd, found Murak's eyes across the square and held them, and thought, with the strange clarity of a man facing his last moments, that if this was how it ended, at least it ended having been truly seen by someone, at least once, at least by her. The axe fell toward the release lever. Murak Doomhammer tore free of the two men holding her with a scream that was not fear but pure, unbound fury, crossed the square faster than anything that size should have been able to move, and caught the descending axe on her own forearm a hand's breadth from the lever, the blade biting deep into flesh and bone with a sound that made half the crowd flinch back, blood running black-red down her arm, and she did not let go. She wrenched the axe from the stunned headsman's grip with her uninjured hand, spun, and in the same motion drove her shoulder into the gallows post hard enough to crack the old timber. And as the trapdoor mechanism jammed and groaned uselessly beneath Clayton's feet instead of dropping him to his death, she was already there, already tearing the noose from his neck with hands slick with her own blood, already pulling him down off the platform and standing over him with the stolen headsman's axe raised against the entire stunned crowd. "The next person who touches him," Murak said, and her voice carried across the harbor square with a terrible, ringing clarity, "loses more than an axe." No one moved. Vale, white-faced, took a stumbling step back from his platform. "You would defend a human traitor against an entire town," he said, though his voice had lost all its earlier certainty. "I would defend this human against anyone," Murak said, "because he threw himself between me and your headsman's blade on this same dock without knowing my name, without knowing if I deserved saving, only knowing that it was wrong to let me die unheard. And I have watched you, magistrate, keep a hammer that is not yours, that you have never once told this harbor was taken from a chieftain's dying hand rather than won in fair war, and lied to every soul here for 30 years that its power to calm the sea came from your family's blessing rather than my clan's blood. Tell them the truth now, or I will tell it for you, and let this town decide who has truly betrayed them." The crowd's murmur turned, slowly, dangerously, toward Vale himself, and in the silence that followed, a voice Clayton had not expected rose from the edge of the square old Ansel Firth, harbor master for 40 years, stepping forward with his weathered face set hard. "My father helped haul that chest off the beach the day it was taken," Ansel said. "He told me before he died it was cut from a dead orc chieftain's hand, not one honest in open battle. Vale's grandfather knew it. I always wondered why Vale kept it locked away instead of showing it proud at festival, if it was truly ours to show." Vale opened his mouth and closed it, and found no words in himself that would survive the weight of the crowd's turning silence. Clayton, still on his knees on the dock planks, his throat raw from the rope, looked up at Murak standing over him with her forearm laid open to the bone and blood dripping steadily onto the boards, and understood, with a clarity that outshone even the terror of the last hour, that this woman, this warrior who could have let Vale's men take him and return to her clan with the hammer and her honor both intact, had thrown all of it away, everything in the space of a single scream. Because she could not stand to watch him die. "Murak," he said, his voice cracking, "your arm." "Is nothing," she said, though her face had gone gray beneath the green, the blood loss finally catching up to the fury that had carried her across the square. She swayed, and Clayton was on his feet in an instant despite his own trembling legs, catching her before she could fall, and this time it was he who tore a strip of cloth to bind a wound, kneeling right there on the dock in front of the whole town, while Corwin Vale stood exposed and stammering before the crowd he had lied to for 30 years. It was old Ansel Firth, in the end, who put an end to the standoff, climbing the gallows platform himself and lifting the wrapped hammer from where Vale had abandoned it in his shock, holding it up before the whole silent square. "This harbor has told itself for 2 generations that we were protected," Ansel said, "by a magistrate's blessing on a stolen weapon. I say we've had 30 years of bad conscience dressed up as good fortune, and I for one am done carrying another family's stolen grief on my back. The orc woman came to take back what was hers. I say we let her." No one argued. Not even Vale, who was quietly and efficiently relieved of both his office and the fine chain of keys around his neck, by 2 of his own former harbor guards before the sun had moved another finger's width across the sky, marched off toward the town's small stone jail to await a proper reckoning. A real trial, this time, with witnesses who would actually be permitted to speak. Murak, her arm bound tight in strips of Clayton's shirt, cradled the recovered hammer against her chest with her good arm, and looked out at the crowd that had, an hour before, howled for the death of the man now kneeling beside her, and found in their faces something she had not expected, not welcome, not yet, not truly, but something quieter, something closer to shame, and beneath the shame, the beginnings of respect. "I will carry this home to my clan," she said, "and tell them that not every human harbor is the same harbor that killed my grandmother's grandmother. I will tell them there is a woodcutter here who bled a magistrate's lie into the open with nothing but stubbornness and an axe, and a harbor master who chose truth over 30 years of comfortable silence. That is not nothing. That is, perhaps, a beginning." The clan came for the hammer 3 days later, a dozen riders under a banner of black and bone white, led by a broad, gray-bearded orc whose bearing left no doubt he was chieftain, Murak's father, Murak Doomhammer, whose eyes when they found his daughter's bound and bloodied arm went first to fury, and then, hearing the whole tale from her own mouth on the harbor road with the whole town watching in wary, respectful silence, to something that looked remarkably like pride. "You went alone against a fortified hall," Murak said, "were caught, nearly executed, and yet you returned not only with the hammer but with the truth of how it was taken, and a human harbor shamed into honesty instead of war. Your sisters lost 3 warriors trying to do what you managed with a woodcutter and a stolen axe." "I did not manage it alone," Murak said, and there was no mistaking the way her eyes found Clayton where he stood at the edge of the gathered crowd, still hollow-eyed from the rope burn at his throat, still watching her the way a man watches something he cannot quite believe he's allowed to keep looking at. "He stood between me and death twice, father, without once asking what I could offer him in return." Murak studied Clayton for a long, weighing moment, the kind of look that made Clayton feel every inch the small, ordinary man he was, plain and sun-browned and unremarkable beside the chieftain's warriors. And then, unexpectedly, the old orc's grim mouth curved into something almost like a smile. "A human who bleeds for an orc's honor without asking a price," Murak said, "is either a great fool or a man worth knowing. My daughter does not waste her regard on fools, whatever her tongue may claim otherwise. I will not command her heart, woodcutter. She has earned the right to give it where she chooses, and no clan law nor harbor law will say otherwise while I hold this hammer." He inclined his head once, formal and final. "You have my thanks and my clan's. What you have with my daughter beyond that is not mine to decide." The clan rode inland with the hammer wrapped once more in fresh oilcloth, but reverently now, openly. No longer a shameful secret locked in cedar, but a chieftain's honor restored in time for the return of ancestors. And Murak did not ride with them. She stayed on the low bluff above the harbor with Clayton, watching the riders shrink into the distant hills, her injured arm bound in a sling of clean linen. The town's own healer had insisted on providing, free of charge, an apology of sorts that no words could have managed half so well. "You could have gone with them," Clayton said quietly. "Your father would have welcomed it. You'd be a hero at your own clan's fire tonight instead of standing on a cold bluff with a woodcutter who nearly got you both killed twice over." "I could have," Murak agreed. "I chose not to." She turned to face him fully, the wind off the water pulling loose strands of dark hair across her face, and there was nothing guarded left in her eyes at all, nothing of the wary warrior who had knelt on a gallows dock and told him she did not need his pity. "I told you once that a debt uncollected has a way of collecting itself, Ramsey. I did not know when I said it that it would be my own heart that came to collect." "Murak, I nearly marked you in that cave," she said, before he could find words of his own. "And I stopped, and told myself it was the noise in the trees that frightened me off, and that was a lie I told myself because the truth frightened me more. The truth is that no orc gives that mark lightly, and I have never once in my life wanted to give it to anyone, human or orc, until a plain, stubborn woodcutter threw an axe into a headsman's swing for a woman he had never spoken to." Her good hand rose, slow and certain this time, to rest against his jaw, and there was no hesitation in it now, none of the trembling uncertainty of the cave. "I'm not asking you again if you would mind bearing it. I already know your answer. I am telling you that I intend to give it here, now, in the open, before this whole harbor and the wide sky both, so that no lock, no chest, no cowardly magistrate's lie can ever again hide what is true between us." "Then give it," Clayton said, his voice rough, his heart pounding harder than it had even facing the rope. "I told you in that cave I wouldn't mind, and I meant it then, and I mean it 100 times more now." She kissed him first again, the way she had that first night by the fire, fierce and certain, and then her mouth moved to the curve of his shoulder where it met his throat. And this time there was no twig snapping in the dark, no interruption from a fearful world, only the wind and the gulls and the wide gray sea below them. And Murak Doomhammer bit down, not hard enough to maim, exactly hard enough to mark. A clean, sharp pain that bloomed into something warm and lasting as she held the bite a long moment before releasing him, her tongue soothing the mark she'd left, her breath ragged against his skin. "There," she said, low and fierce and trembling with an emotion she no longer bothered to hide. "Now the whole world may look at you and know exactly whose you are, woodcutter, and I would like to see any magistrate, any crowd, any clan elder try to unmake that." Clayton touched the mark at his shoulder, the blood already slowing, already claimed, and found he was laughing, helpless and overwhelmed and happier than he had been in the whole of his quiet, solitary life among the pines. "I've been called a fool twice in 1 week," he said, "by the same woman, and I think I'd happily be called it 1,000 more times if it means keeping you." "You will not need to be called it again," Murak said, pulling him close, her injured arm careful around his shoulders, her whole powerful body curved protectively, possessively, lovingly around his. "Because I do not intend to leave you standing alone at any gallows, real or otherwise, ever again. I chose you on that dock the moment you threw your body between me and a blade for no reason but that it was right, and I have been too proud and too frightened to say it plainly until now. I am saying it plainly now. I choose you, Clayton Ramsey, not as a debt, not as a duty, as mine freely and forever if you will have me." "I've wanted to be had," Clayton said, Since the moment you called me a fool on that walk home and almost smiled doing it." They stood together on the bluff a long while after that. The harbor spread out below them, going about its ordinary business. Fishing boats returning with the tide, gulls wheeling and crying over the nets, old Ansel Firth directing the unloading of the day's catch with the easy authority of a man restored to trust. And somewhere among the stone cottages, a magistrate awaited a trial that would finally be honest. And somewhere inland a clan rode home with its ancestors' honor restored. And none of it mattered half so much in that moment as the mark warm and singular at Clayton's shoulder, and the woman beside him who had chosen, out of an entire wide and dangerous world, an ordinary charcoal burner at the edge of the graywood to call her own. "I have a poor cabin and 3 charcoal pits and no great fortune to offer a chieftain's daughter," Clayton said eventually, half laughing, half serious, as they turned from the bluff toward the tree line and the smoke-smudged path home. "I did not choose you for fortune," Murak said, taking his hand in hers, her grip warm and sure and entirely unafraid of what the harbor town or her own clan or the wide uncertain world might make of an orc warrior walking hand in hand with a human woodcutter down a public road in the open light of day. "I chose you because you looked at a stranger kneeling at a gallows and could not stand to see it, and because you have never once, in all the days since, asked me to be smaller or quieter or less than exactly what I am. That is worth more to me than any fortune, Ramsey. That is worth everything." They walked back into the trees together as the sun dropped low and gold over the restless gray sea, the bite mark on his shoulder still warm beneath his shirt, her hand tight and certain in his, and neither of them looked back toward the harbor at all, because there was nothing behind them left to fear, and everything that mattered now lay simply, entirely in each other.